And where we are this evening, we're here with this Focus with Water. We're just a few days away from World Rivers Day, which is this Sunday, the 26th of September. And World Rivers Day is there as a celebration of the world's waterways, but also about raising awareness of the many threats that our waterways face and how we can be actively involved. So at Sacred Earth Activism, as many people know, there's been a waters group that formed off the back of our conference earlier on in the year. And what we are looking to do is be putting our support behind the rights for rivers and looking at how we can weave our sacred practice and our sacred activism in support of the rivers. So tonight we're really grateful to be joined by Paul Powlesland to talk to us about that. And so to introduce Paul, Paul's a barrister at the Garden Court Chambers and is the founder of the NGO Lawyers for Nature, and campaigns for the legal recognition of the rights of nature. And this evening we'll be introducing us to the rights of rivers, how we can make them a reality, and how sacred activism is an important part of that. And we will have chance for some questions and answers at the end of the talk. So please use the chat section on the talk there, on the side panel there, to pop your questions in, and we'll be picking questions out towards the end. So welcome, Paul, and thank you very much for coming along. And I'd like to pass over to you then, please, to tell us what you have to tell us.
Thank you, Jonathan. And just to reiterate what Jonathan said there, this is an interesting talk for me because I normally come from a very different end of the process, trying to persuade lawyers and maybe environmental activists why they should effectively take a more spiritual approach to rivers. So it's very interesting addressing people who I don't have to convince that on, and it feels like a very different process. So I'm going to talk for maybe no more than hopefully 15 minutes to introduce the broad concept of rights of rivers. But I'd love for the evening to be mostly spent in a dialogue and for you to ask questions, so I know I'm answering the things that you actually want to hear about, and it tends to bring my thoughts out better too. So do get thinking about that. So to introduce myself, ironically, it's something I've wanted to do for a while, and it feels like the perfect time to do this, to introduce myself as to where I'm from and which river catchment I'm in. Because of course, every single drop of water that falls anywhere on the earth will eventually end up in a river catchment. And many people don't know where theirs is, although I imagine most people on this call probably do. So maybe later on, if you want to introduce yourself as well, you can say which river catchment you're in. It'd be nice to hear that. For me, it's very easy to know because I'm on a literal river, kind of in the river in some ways. I'm on my boat on the River Roding in London, which is the third largest river in London, and the river that I've taken something of an oath to care for and protect, which I'll talk about later in terms of practicalities of how we can make rights of rivers a reality. And yeah, the boat sort of sits in the water almost, so I'm floating on her right now. And normally I'd be outside, and so you could see the kind of beautiful reeds and trees that are all around me, but unfortunately autumn is on its way and it's dark outside now. So very briefly, how I got interested in rights of nature is through my work as a lawyer seeking to protect nature. And I initially got into nature protection work through protecting trees. And many of you may have heard of the Sheffield Tree Campaign, where thousands of local people effectively rose up, disobeyed the law, and saved tens of thousands of their street trees from being destroyed by the local council. And that really got me into grassroots environmental protection work. And that's what led me to found Lawyers for Nature. And that's what I'm still doing day to day. But being someone who loves nature and wants to protect and care for it, whilst at the same time working in the current legal system, is in many ways a very difficult and depressing place to be. Because as many of you will probably know, our legal system does not protect or respect nature in most respects. And it can be very challenging to constantly fight and lose battles to protect nature. And through doing that work, I have realized that we need to take a different, longer term approach than constantly using the current environmental law to try and protect nature. Because if we do, we'll always be sort of on the back foot, always fighting a losing battle. And it's interesting that in the last few decades, as environmental protections through the law have ostensibly increased, as the acronyms and the NGOs and all of the laws and statutes surrounding the environment have increased, so has the destruction. You know, it hasn't even stopped or reduced it, it's increased in that time. So we need a different approach. And for me, environmental law is clearly coming from the wrong approach, because it's again looking at it from a human-centric way of how do we as humans change and deal with the environment, something external to us. And that's, I think, the wrong approach. Now, I am going to skip a step here, because normally there's quite a big step in these talks where I have to convince the audience that effectively we are all one, that humans are not separate from nature, and that we are part of Earth and nature. Obviously, I don't think many people on this call will need convincing of that. So I'll jump over that step and take that as read, that you all believe that is the case. If you want to discuss that in the questions, then let me know. So that being the case, how do we begin to reflect that truth in our legal system? And for me, rights of nature seems to be the best vehicle for doing that. Now, rights of nature is quite a broad term, and it covers two distinct aspects. So on the one hand, you've got legal personality for nature, and on the other hand, you have the substantive rights that nature is given. So if we use me as an example, I have legal personality because I'm a human. All humans have legal personality. They can sue in courts, they can bring cases, they can be sued, and they have rights and duties that apply to them. But that's obviously very different to the contents of those rights. In most places around the world, as a human being, I would have legal personality. I think in all places, I would have legal personality. But of course, the actual rights that I'm given are very different, say, from in the UK versus in the US versus in, say, China. And, you know, in England, there's been a constant battle to fight for greater rights for humans, for instance, in the Institution of the Human Rights Act. So that's just to say that even when we get legal personality for nature, there's still going to be an on-running battle as to what the rights of nature should actually substantively be. And that's why this isn't going to be a kind of one-off change that we do and then everything's fine. It's going to be the work of our lifetimes, and indeed probably our descendants too, for humans to come into balance in nature. But I do believe that this idea of rights of nature is that first important step, and that legal personality for nature and self-ownership for nature are key parts of that. So legal personality is often quite a hard concept for people to grasp, because it's quite an artificial one. But effectively, starting from, say, 2,000 years ago, there's been a constant extension of who has legal personality and legal rights. So 2,000 years ago, only kind of rich, white, non-slave men had that. And over the last few thousand years, we've been gradually extending it to a point now that all humans mostly have it, but also even fictional entities that humans have made up. So, of course, charities and most egregiously companies have legal personality and rights that apply to them. And I always think that it's shocking, although perhaps when you think of lawyers and what they're like, maybe not shocking, that as humans, we've managed to give rights to entirely fictional entities that we've made up before we gave them to things that actually exist and for which we rely on for our own existence. That we managed to give something to a completely fictional thing like a company before trees and rivers, which are there, you know. Maybe that's a testament to the clever imagination of lawyers. But the example I always give is that, you know, you could go on your phone now and really, probably during the rest of this talk, in the time available, you could, for the price of £12, create a company, which in legal terms would have more personality and more legal rights and obligations than the entirety of nature, than this river that I sit on, that has been here since before humans came to these islands and will be here long after at least our society is gone. Pretty shocking. So by using an example of companies, I suppose that's kind of getting an idea of what legal personality is. And within that, and somewhere between legal personality and legal rights, is this idea of self-ownership. Now, the English legal system is based around a concept of dominion, that man has dominion over nature and that man owns nature, which is often at the forefront of a lot of the destruction that we see to the natural world. I actually, not on this river, I actually own a small piece of riverbank out in the countryside. And under the laws of England, I therefore own half of the river up to the midway point, which I always think is just completely mad that I, as a human being with such a short lifespan, have this idea of dominion over this river that has existed probably before modern anatomical humans came into being. It's completely bizarre, but has very bad effects, because subject to quite loose environmental regulations, I can then do what I want to it. And I've always found that power to be shocking, and a power that I don't really want to have, and that none of us should have. So how do we begin to change that and address that? Well, around the world, there have been many examples of countries that are bringing about the rights of nature into reality. And there can be for all aspects of nature, but rivers are really one of the easiest, because trying to draft a declaration of the rights of trees is actually quite hard. But rivers is in some ways the easiest first part of nature to give rights to. And a number of countries have done that, particularly in South America. There's also been some rumblings in America and Canada, and most importantly New Zealand, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Now, one of the things that those countries almost always have in common is a strong Indigenous voice, which is calling for these rights. Because, of course, to most Indigenous cultures, they've never lost that idea that nature has a personality. It is a thing that we are connected to and should have rights. It's really the kind of Western system, which is often derived from the English common law, which has imposed that around the world. And so we see countries that have a strong Indigenous voice is often leading the way in this. And that's why I want to use the example of New Zealand, because New Zealand has a legal system that's probably the most similar to the English legal system as any other in the world, because of the colonial aspect, and the fact that I think it's only in the last few decades that it got its own Supreme Court, for instance. We're still reliant on using English judges until then. But despite having such a similar system to us, they've managed to give legal rights, personality, and ownership to the Wanganui River, which is the sacred river to the Maori people. And the Maori people demanded that the Wanganui River be given this right as part of its peace settlement with the Crown. I can't go into depth in the amount of time I had to explain what that entails, but effectively they have given ownership of the river to itself, with a group of overseers which are drawn from lots of different communities, including the Maori people, to look out for the interests of the river. It's not perfect. It has a number of things that could go further, but it is one of the most radical examples of where that's being done anywhere in the world. And it's also very interesting, if you read the act that gives rise to it, just how spiritual some of the language is, actually. As a lawyer reading it, English legal texts and acts of parliament are incredibly dry. And reading this act of parliament, which talks about the river as effectively an ancestral spirit of the Maori people, was beautiful, really, really beautiful. And in many ways, maybe that idea of a spiritual connection with the river is intrinsic to bringing about rights of nature. And I do urge you to maybe read that act and read some about the Wanganui River if you want to kind of feel more about how the rights of nature can be enacted. So moving on to the situation in the UK, and I don't know how many people we've got from around the world here, so I hope this isn't too unhelpful for you if you're in another country. Do say if you're in other places that you would like a more specific example if I'm able to give them. But in terms of the situation in the UK, and indeed many nations without a strong Indigenous presence, it is going to be much harder to bring about the rights of nature in a legal sense. And the UK is going to be a particularly hard nut to crack because, you know, we were one of the first countries to lose our indigenous presence. We were one of the first countries to industrialize, to disconnect people from the land and to lose that spiritual connection between people and the land and nature. We also have a political context that is unfriendly to environmentalism and things that are regarded as kind of hippie, I would say. And it has been attempted to bring it about in the most loose and simple way, which was to, in Frome, they tried to give rights to the River Frome. The local council were supportive of that, and they put local bylaws in place to do that. So democratically voted on by local people and enacted, and those were vetoed by central government because they were felt to be a bit too radical and sort of undermining existing environmental law, they said. So it is going to be difficult to enact the rights of nature in the UK. Now, in a legal sense. So the question in terms of what do we do? And for me, I don't want to sort of hold up my hands and say, well, okay, we'll give up or try again in 10 years or something. And for me, there are potential routes forward to trying to bring about the rights of nature in this country through activism. Well, I hadn't actually thought about this, and only until I met Jonathan and found out about spiritual activism, I was actually sort of like, that's exactly the word I want to use for it. Somewhere between law, activism, and spirituality, there is a route forward. And the way that we at Lawyers for Nature are advocating is for people to draft their own rights of rivers declarations. So there's a kind of form declaration that already exists. If you Google the Rights of Rivers Declaration, it's a global one, which is quite lengthy and includes all the different potential rights that a river might have. And those can then be adapted to local circumstances. So in England, for instance, we might have slightly less problems with dams than some places, but we have more problems with, say, sewage and over abstraction. So you can then adapt the declaration to your own local needs and then gather together and declare those rights. Now, that, of course, has absolutely no legal consequences whatsoever. The law remains exactly the same once you've made that declaration as before. But I'm sure, as most people on this call will realize, the power of intention, prayer, and declaration can be a very deep one indeed, and can have a far greater power than might appear on the surface. The first such of these actually was back in on Midsummer's Eve this year, where the Friends of the River Cam, I gave a talk similar to this, but to a less kind of spiritual aspect. It was more to people who were concerned about over abstraction, the River Cam, and they decided after hearing that talk to do their declaration. And so on Midsummer's evening, we gathered together, I think about 150 people on the banks of the Cam, and they drafted their rights, and we read them out and declared them, which was beautiful. One of the things I actually wanted or felt from that declaration was there needed to be, I think, a bit more spiritual power to it. For me, it felt like it didn't have enough of that. It was a beautiful evening. There was poetry, there was songs, but I want, for me, for a declaration that I do, I'd want a deeper spiritual aspect to it. The other crucial thing then, on top of that, is that ordinary people be given the tools to begin to enact those rights in the here and now, within the current political, legal, and activist framework. And that's something that we at Lawyers for Nature want to start drafting and doing. And these toolkits, we think, could go in three broad categories. So for each right, you would have tools within three sort of frameworks. So the first is practical. So using the example of, say, rubbish in rivers. So we declare that our rivers have a right to be free of rubbish. Okay, has no legal effect, but here's how you can begin to enact that declaration. One, practical action. Here's how you can organize a river cleanup day. Here's how you can get grants for equipment. Here's where you can buy the equipment. Here's some ideas on insurance and organizing that kind of thing. Second stream is legal. So here's the current legal framework on rubbish pollution. Here's how you can get a litter abatement order from your local council. And here's how you can get an injunction against someone fly tipping, all those kinds of things. Then the third aspect would be activism, which can be all different kinds, of course. You know, it can be, here's a petition you could sign, here's how you can set up your own petition. Here are the names and addresses of the top 20, top 50 litter producing polluters in the UK. And so if you, and here are their brands. So for every single branded bottle, you can find out where it comes from. And personally, I'm getting to the stage now where on the roading, I'm not going to be picking out the litter and just throwing it away anymore. I'm going to be sorting through it and taking it back to the people who've done that and filming that and take it to the head office. I think you've dropped something here. I found this in my river. Do you want it back? And if you don't, can you tell me why you're running a system that this ends up in my river? So those are the three streams: practical, legal, and sort of activism. And you can do that for every single right. So for sewage, practical, here's how you can do water testing on your river to find out if there's sewage in it. 2, here's the current legal framework on sewage, because actually most of it's illegal at the moment. 3, here's how, even if sewage discharge is illegal, here's the address of the main water companies and the kinds of actions you might consider doing against them. And within that, everyone can take their role in upholding the rights of rivers. So, you know, some people are more able to do direct action. Some people are more able to do the kind of litter picking. Some people are able to sign petitions or do letters and things like that. And everyone has a role they can play. And the example I often give is, you know, we actually have a lot of laws that affect nature at the moment, but just not enforced. So, sewage is particularly good, but most of the sewage discharges that come into our rivers in the UK are completely illegal. They're not allowed to happen, but no one knows they're happening. And even if they do, the Environment Agency is just not enforcing. And I give you a practical example just to, I think I'm a bit over time, but I'll round off with your permission, Jonathan. I'll round off with a little story about the roading. We were doing a litter cleanup day on the roading, and this is the river that I live on and that I've taken something of an oath to protect. And actually, I was doing a talk, I think a couple of years ago, about the rights of nature. And during the talk, I sort of came up with this idea. It just happened to me. I just sort of said, you know, we love this river and we'll do whatever it takes to protect her. And I realized that's a very powerful statement, even in its own right. We haven't even done the Declaration of Rivers on the Roading, Rights of Rivers on the Roading yet, but we're going to. But even that intention that you love this river and you will do whatever you can to peacefully protect her, it is a powerful intention. And that's already working through. So we were having a litter cleanup day on the river with 30 volunteers. I noticed this really strong smell of sewage. It's the part of the river I don't normally go to. It's very inaccessible, and found an outfall that was spewing sewage into the river completely illegally. But no, it'd been happening for months, but no one had noticed. And so we were able to inform Thames Water and they got it sorted. But then we wanted to go further and say, well, actually, no, you can't keep doing this. So I researched the law and found out that actually that sewage overspill was illegal and threatened them with legal action, got in touch with various local MPs and sort of created a stink on our Facebook group. I also took 5 litres of the water from the sewage outfall and kept it in a bottle to potentially take to their headquarters if they refuse to do what we said, and pour it over their front desk and say, well, if this is okay for you, why isn't it okay on your front reception desk? But actually that wasn't necessary, because Thames Water took it seriously, because they realised, oh crap, committed people on the ground who love their river and will do what they can to protect it are not something they want. They recognise the dangers to their company. They took it very seriously. We had a meeting with their state environmental director, pretty high up in the company, and they're now taking action to stop that sewage going in. Now, as I said before, the legal framework, exactly the same. But had we not been here on this river with that commitment to protect her, that sewage spill could well still be going on. And even if it was shut off, they wouldn't do what they need to do to stop it happening long term. So that's just one example of how having people who have declared the rights of their river and decided to protect it can be really powerful. And I believe that can be magnified and multiplied all around this country and indeed around the world. And to finish off, the example I always give is, if I was to choose between having a Rights of Rivers Act 2025 from the UK Parliament, but having the same enforceability regime as we currently have, versus having the law as it currently stands, but with a group of committed protectors on every river in the UK who've declared its rights and pledged to peacefully uphold them, I would choose the latter. And the joy of the latter is we don't have to wait for anyone. We're not hostage to fortune. You know, I can't make a Rights of Rivers Act 2025 happen, but I can go out tomorrow and declare the rights of my river and act as if they're true. And if we all do that, not only will we be upholding the rights in the here and now, I also think we'll be making proper legal changes more likely to happen in the long run as well. And at the end of these talks to sort of groups of lawyers and activists, I usually say to them to, you know, even as a first step, just to go down to their river and spend some time with it and pray at their river. But I imagine all of you probably do that anyway. So again, we can possibly not skip that step, still do it, but I probably don't need to tell you to do that. But I do urge you to maybe go down with that intention of seeking to protect your river, and then to work out how you begin to do that. If there's a friends of group, so I set up the Friends of the River Roading, which now has over 2,000 members on Facebook. If there's a friends of group existing already, then join it and, you know, maybe radicalize it. If there's no friends of group, set it up, and begin to work out what your river needs and how you can make that happen. And it's really wonderful to hear that for the Rivers Day coming up in the weekend, that it's going to be a combination of that sacred, but also that practical action of doing river cleanups and things. And it's really wonderful to hear that combination, because I really believe that the one influences the other, and bringing those elements together can have a real power to it. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. Really, really grateful for all that. It's been really fascinating to hear it all. We've got a lot of questions as well in the audience of people who are interested in hearing more what you've got to say around all of this. But yeah, as Paul kind of just mentioned at the end there is the plans for this Sunday, the Back to Source sacred action combining ceremony and direct action, and perhaps somebody would be able to just pop into the chat at some point one of the links to the event pages, just in case there's anybody who wants to see a bit more information on that. We can talk a little bit about that right at the end, but in the meantime, Paul, there was a few questions in there. The first one was when you were discussing the concept of dominion in English law, and Sue asks kind of where does that concept of dominion that we have set in the law come from?
It's a really interesting question. It's probably from the Christian tradition originally. I think the Bible very much sets down that idea of man having dominion over nature, and I think it feels quite hardwired into our society in that sense. I think it also, although it originated from there, I think it's also has a particular strong, it's become particularly strong in our society because of feudalism, which still forms the basis of our land tenure in this country. We're still a feudal society. Like literally, there's actually no you don't actually own land in this country. You still hold it of the Queen. It's still feudal tenure. And of course, many of the people who originally stole the land back in 1066 still actually have it, and still not only exclude us from it, but also use it to destroy nature a lot of the time. And also, of course, the fact we were, the first to industrialize and have been one of the longest lasting capitalist societies. Capitalism inherently demands that nature be turned into a product, and therefore we must have dominion over it. In legal terms, it's actually quite interesting because there's a legal scholar called Blackstone, who basically his institutes were sort of the legal textbook for about 2 centuries. So almost all of the judges who were making the law throughout the late 18th, 19th, and 19th and early 20th centuries would have relied on his institutes to learn the law. And he had a specific part where he says effectively that rights over land come from man's dominion over nature. And it is that I think we in the UK have then exported around the world with our colonialism, which forms so much of the, or rather gave rise to so much of the dominion that we see in many countries around the world, and therefore forms the basis of so much of our environmental problems in the world. And that's why I believe there's a real importance to almost go to the belly of the beast, which is the UK, and which is also the legal profession within the UK. To be a barrister, you have to be a member of what's called an Inn of Court, and there's 4 of them. I'm a member of Middle Temple, and that's where Blackstone was. And I really want to go to Middle Temple and just host a discussion even about the rights of nature, or begin to like promulgate the rights there, to like go right into the heart of that system that initially caused this way of relating to nature, and to try and change it.
Oh, sounds very powerful what you describe when you talk about it in that way, because there's something in that of kind of going to heal the original wound, as it were, if talking about that as kind of being the starting point of where a lot of that mindset was exported out around the world. As you say, if it's something that can be done here, that would be kind of quite a powerful in terms of how that is held around the world as well. Thank you. Another question is from Barbara, asking about legal personality, and asking, does legal personality then imply the ability to act and bring legal action, even if that might be by proxy?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we the reason I gave the other examples of legal personality than humans is because it's often quite hard to think, well, how can a river have legal personality, because a river can't sue someone? But of course, a child can't sue someone. Someone who's mentally incapacitated can't sue someone, and a charity or company can't sue one, because a charity or company literally doesn't exist in its own right. It's entirely a fiction. So of course, in all those instances, we would have people acting for them. And then there's a whole other question that opens up, what is in someone's best interest? And of course, for humans, we're still trying to work that out. And there's a whole area of law, of course, around, say, children, of what is in a child's best interests, which probably needs to actually be radically reformed, of course, given many of the things that our society thinks is in children's interest probably isn't in reality. But we need to start making those steps. And it's a very interesting question to work out within these declarations how we would decide what is in the river's best interests. And it's something that a small group of us are starting to discuss and to try and work out and to take first steps on. On the roading, I'd quite like to appoint a kind of guardianship committee of people who are acting in the river's interests, and they can be drawn from lots of different groups. So you could have a representative of someone who lives on the river in a boat, local community, some ecologists, some local spiritual leaders or religious leaders, things like that, to work out what, and then discuss, and then work out what is in the river's best interests. I would say as well that it's also worth noting that it's going to be quite hard to know when we start getting down to fine degrees what's in the river's interests. But we're also starting from a very low baseline. So we don't necessarily know what the rights of nature are, but we know what we know what the wrongs of nature are. I think it's pretty obvious that the river shouldn't have loads of rubbish in it and raw sewage going into it. And then let's start with the obvious stuff, and then if we solve those, it's going to become much more intricate to work out, well, actually, does this dam does this dam, is it a bad thing or a good thing? It kind of keeps the water level high, but it's stopping the fish passage, probably needs to go. Much more difficult to work out, well, actually, what kind of trees do we plant here? Do we plant trees? Do we let it naturally rewild? Difficult questions. But starting off now, I think a guardianship committee can easily say what we can start doing. Yeah. And actually, on the river roading, one of the ways we're trying to do that is the work is done through the River Roading Trust, which I set up a couple of years ago, and we're about to appoint a trustee to the trust who's to speak for the rights of the river, which I think is the first time that's happened in the UK. It's the first Rivers Trust to actually have a trustee representing the river on the board. So she speaks for that. And of course, then I might speak for the boaters and local residents, but we need to have the river's voice there.
Yeah, there's a question that kind of sort of leads on directly from that just come in from Ellen. And the question is, how do you feel about kind of the shift then? There's still a kind of very much a we deciding for the rivers. And the question is about us, how do you feel about us stopping deciding for the rivers and beginning to relearn?
How do we learn how to ask rivers?
Yeah, so about relearning how to ask the river herself what she needs?
Yes, that's the point.
Thanks, Ellen.
That's a good question. I feel like many people on this call are going to be more qualified to answer that than me. I would say that perhaps someone who is an elder who is deeply connected to the river and is able to have the ability to ask this question will be represented on that group, and to speak for the river as best as possible. It's also interesting to say, you know, I don't necessarily think that the rights of nature are the complete end goal here. Fundamentally, the current legal order needs to shift, but in ways that I don't think from the starting position we're in we can even begin to comprehend, if that makes sense. Like I don't think once we walk this path that is the end result, but equally until we start walking the path, I don't think anyone can say what that end result is. I think we have a real need to start bringing nature's voice into the current legal system as best we can, and that rights of nature offers that. But I can also see why some people who are, you know, deeply spiritual, connected to nature would say, well, actually, we shouldn't even be talking about what humans are going to do to nature, because, you know, nature just does its own thing. To which I would say, well, the current legal system is here. It's exerting its power in the here and now, and we need to find a way to bring nature's voice into that. But as a first step to probably a whole different, not only legal order, but way of being between humans and nature.
Absolutely. And as you say, kind of the first step is just within that system that we have of giving it personality, having personhood, having it being recognized.
Yeah, I mean, my hope and wish is that one day, when if I carry on doing the Rights of Rivers campaign throughout my life, you know, when I'm an elder, I'll be seen as, like, you know, the things that I'm proposing now would be seen as like very, you know, conservative first steps on the radical path that people much younger than me are doing then, you know. Like that it was a great first step. It was nowhere near where we ended up. That's my hope and wish, but I also think that this is the first step towards that.
That's a wonderful vision. We'll sharing that with you. There was a question earlier on as well from Chloe. You had been talking about as well your work with the Trees campaign, and Chloe asks, can you explain why rivers are easier to give legal personality to than trees?
Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't entirely figured out. I know there is, but I haven't entirely figured out why. I think it's because the nature of human interaction with rivers is easier to draw into a rights-based framework, because there will always be interactions between humans and nature. But when I sup, if I was to drink from a river, which actually I do because I have a filter, so I do take water out of the river, I'm interacting with it, I'm using it in a sense. That feels like less of an imposition than, say, me interacting with a tree by cutting part of it down. And it's really hard to say what is what a tree wants in that sense, and how we can interact with a tree in a way that gives it rights. It's really hard to balance it, because I think humans would need to interact with trees in some ways. We are part of nature, and we would be interacting with them. But how, obviously at the moment, it's completely disgusting the way we're doing it. We know the way we're chopping down so many forests and acting with such destruction. But drawing that line is harder, I think, with trees. And maybe it's because we often look at individual trees, and it's quite hard to say what an individual tree's rights are, but maybe as part of a forest, you can say that. And a river in that sense is sort of is more like a forest, isn't it? It's like it's a much bigger entity that doesn't depend on like an individual part. So yeah, for instance, with a forest, we could say, you know, you've got to manage it sustainably, or you've got to interact with it sustainably. That might mean that individual trees are coppiced, for instance, which that individual tree might not want. I don't know. That was basically freeform, me thinking out loud. I think it's because rivers are bigger and can be looked at as a whole, and therefore are easier to codify as that. Which is not to say that trees' rights shouldn't happen. I'm really intrigued if someone wants to like join in with the drafting of that, because we could really do with that. Yeah,
fantastic.
And also there's also broader legal frameworks to protect rivers that exist. You know, trees is a lot harder, and the law is even worse for trees in terms of protection.
Mm-hmm. All right, just picking out another question here. I think actually it's one that I wanted to bring you back to kind of one of the things that you were talking about, in how where you were speaking often with groups that are groups of lawyers, and you're talking to them about our interconnectedness with everything else, but particularly kind of in explaining that for rivers. And I kind of imagine kind of going forward, as with all of this requires a lot of working together with different groups, and it will be groups including people who don't kind of firsthand recognize or understand that interconnectedness. And I just wondered, what would you say is sort of the top point or points that you find kind of to be persuasive or compelling when speaking to people from more of a legal background?
Yeah, it really depends on the audience. When I speak to law students, and I often take a kind of quite spiritual view of things. Some lawyers I speak to and talk about, you know, just the failure of current environmental law. Some group, you know, the Friends of the River Cam that declared the rights, they came at it from not a particularly spiritual perspective, you know, quite a utilitarian, that they actually initially wanted to try and resist development in the Cambridge area that would basically have over abstracted the Cam. And they came to me actually initially for legal advice. How do we legally stop this? And I was like, well, actually, it's quite hard in the current legal framework. But have you heard of the rights of nature? And actually, that then led them down that path, being like, oh, we could actually use this as like a broad framework for our campaign. And then once they declared that, they were like, oh, there's also a sewage problem in the Cam as well, and there's rubbish. Wait a second. And you kind of like you find out what particular thing interests people, and then use that to like. Because almost every facet that people are interested in rivers can be reflected in the rights of nature and the rights of rivers discourse. So it's about kind of tailoring it to the audience, I suppose. Which is sort of what I've done here as well. Although I'm noticing the questions maybe not enough. I have to say, I've been noticing someone, I'm not able to read at the same time because I've got to speak to you, but someone saying I should be more interactive, I think, with my river, and to ask and speak to her more, which I will take on board.
Well, thanks for that, Paul. There's a lot of kind of excitement as well from in there to do with how we can interweave this with what we're doing, and I kind of just end on kind of the it's got a question mark, but I think it's a little bit more of a point here, or kind of left as an open-ended question, kind of going, the sacred intention of all of this is so powerful. And it's a hope that we can kind of create ritual and create kind of a holding of sacred spaces, just paraphrasing you, Lauren, to accompany this declaration of rights for our rivers. And that would be kind of lovely to be a part of, and to support with all of our local rivers going forward, and be involved in that way.
And that's something I really would love people to be more involved in. I said that the CAM declaration was great, but for me, it lacks certain aspects of spirituality. And like, for instance, on the roading, I've done, reasonable amounts of ceremony in my time, but I haven't really held those myself. I'm more into the kind of legal and activism side of things. So if that's what people feel called to do as their offering, is to create that ceremony and that depth that will like really make people feel this and really make them want to protect their rivers and uphold their rights, and that's a massive gift. And I'd love it if you wanted to get on board and give that gift to different communities. I've got various communities that are already interested in trying to declare rights of their rivers. And I'm hopefully going to turn this into a broader campaign in a few months' time, and I imagine there'll be many, many more. And it might be good to maybe keep in touch if anyone is able to help in the ceremonial aspect, because that's a real gift that I'm sure many people on this call would be able to give, and presumably would quite like to be able to give.
That would be absolutely fantastic, Paul. We would kind of be very happy to kind of keep in contact with all of this and help connect people up in whatever ways we can. I want to just kind of close with a big thanks to you, Paul. That's been really, really fantastic to hear kind of the practical kind of sides of what you've been doing already, and how kind of we can sort of approach this going forward. As you say, you know, there's people in the group here that this really makes sense to. This kind of, you know, is central to kind of our relationship with the world around us. But we live within a system that doesn't recognize that. And I kind of really honor you and thank you for all the work you've been doing to try and, you know, shoehorn this idea and this understanding into kind of the legal system. And that absolute point of, well, let's go out and act as if it is the case. And let's carry on. Let's honor and recognize this inherent rights of rivers, and kind of, you know, force the system in that way to do the same. I'm really, really grateful for you sharing that with us there this evening.
Also, I was just going to say, normally at a talk in person, you know, there's often a kind of, you'd give the main talk and have the main question, and then people will come up to the speaker afterwards. I often quite like that. I often quite like have nice interaction. So completely optional. If anyone feels they want to, and this is allowed, Jonathan, I don't know. If anyone would like to have a little further chat or ask specific questions after, I can stay on for another sort of 10 minutes afterwards. People want to remain behind and have a little further chat or ask questions about specific rivers or specific points they want to discuss. I'm happy to. So. That's
lovely. Trying to keep hold of some of those kind of real experiences from talks, even though we're in the online space.
Right. I sort of missed them in a weird way.
Yeah. The kind of the conversations around coffee afterwards. Super.
Yeah, and if not, actually, I'm just gonna stay online and just read all the comments because I haven't had a chance, because it's been so busy. So I'm gonna have a little chance to read as well. So wonderful. Thanks for joining, everyone. It's been really lovely.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks to everybody for coming along, for all of your questions. And yeah, once again, big thanks to you, Paul, and we look forward to kind of helping in what ways we can in future.